Well, they tell me I'm supposed to just buy a few minutes because we're going to apply microphones to our next panelists. So this might be an opportunity for a brief restroom break. I'll just talk about a few thoughts, though, about the panel, and thank you very much to Michael and Patrick and Winnie for their thoughts. I think that just the example of Kodak was very thought-provoking and reminded me of two of my favorite books by the same author, Neil Christensen, The Innovator's Dilemma and The Innovator's Solution, which talk a lot about how to deal with these disruptions. And I think Michael used a phrase, inexperience, as a core competency, which I think is addressed in some of these books. At lunch, we talked a little bit about is there an opportunity for a young person to be what we used to refer to as a shade tree mechanic, somebody who learns to work on cars by themselves. And it made me wonder whether the idea of the introduction of some more amateur people via 3D printing provides that same avenue to shade tree mechanics and manufacturing. So coming up next, we'll be talking about our next panel session is open source software development, led by Ryan Singer, and I'm just going to wait for the signal of our microphones. Of CryptoCorp, and Ryan will introduce his panelists when they're ready.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ryan.
Hello. My name is Ryan Singer. I've been working in open source software full-time since I was 15 years old. My job there was with the Georgia Technology Authority, and I wrote the authentication authorization policy for the state portal for the state of Georgia. And I've been stuck on open source and standards ever since. And in 2012, I got involved with a particularly interesting open source community, the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But I'd like to introduce these guys. Coming up here is Jim Zemlin. Jim's the executive director of the Linux Foundation. Originally, the claim to fame was they employed Linus Torvalds so that no vendor could have him in control. And since then, they've been doing a lot of really good infrastructure stuff around all of the main projects related to Linux that all of us run. And then next up, we have Avery. Avery, what's your job title at?
I'm a software engineer.
OK, so Avery's a software engineer at Facebook and really involved with their open source efforts. And they do basically everything open source except for the stuff that sorts the news feed. And so that's really exciting stuff. And then last up, we have Andreas, who's the new CTO at Mozilla and has been involved with them for a long time. And Mozilla's the first and most interesting, I think, of the really big open source foundations, and really the only ones who are really pushing client-side open source in the internet world. And that's very, very important work. So to talk about what I think is important here and how my path has gone through this world, my first few jobs were enterprise jobs. I worked at the state of Georgia on the state portal, and then I worked at Sun Microsystems on desktop solutions. And that got me really involved with thinking about how enterprises, like governments and like large corporations, consume software and how they consume open source software, and how that can be different and how that can be interesting. That, as a career, is really difficult. Because what we were trying to do was we were trying to get an idea about this changing ecosystem where institutions were starting to move away from using things like Oracle, where their in-house support and their in-house integrators were specialists for a particular vendor, and instead moved to things like MySQL, where their in-house support and their in-house integrators were actually contributors to the project and were just as important as the people who worked at the vendors. And that change was very, very difficult for organizations like Fujitsu and for organizations like IBM and organizations like Oracle to wrap their minds around. Moving from customers are customers and vendors are vendors to customers are kind of vendors too. As I moved through that, what eventually ended up becoming a dominant theme was this idea that Jim's going to talk a lot about external innovation communities, and how once you get to a certain scale in supporting open source projects inside your organization or developing open source projects inside your organization, influencing what other people contribute suddenly becomes a major goal. And it creates roles like a developer evangelist, which never existed for organizations like IBM or Fujitsu before, where you really started as a marketing exercise trying to influence what other vendors were doing. And I did that for 5 years of my career, advised people on how to hire, how to train, and how to manage developer evangelists. Really interesting spin. And then the last few years, I've pivoted into Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is, to me, an even farther expression of this trend. And this is going to get into a lot of what Avery's going to talk about how Facebook and other major Web 2.0 vendors like Facebook and Twitter and Google view open source, where open source is becoming this thing that startups do, right? Bootstrap startups and seed-funded startups will never pay software licensing fees. They can't afford it. So they build their products on top of open source software, and they build the expertise in-house to modify it slightly to do what they need to do. And as that scales, and as they raise bigger and bigger fundraising rounds, they continue being a part of those communities and contributing to those communities. As a result, any product or any application that's common between these startups ends up open source. Startups specialize in their secret sauce, so they open source everything else. And you end up with open sources moving up and up the stack to things that used to be things that you built entire software businesses on. And it's moving even as far as things that non-tech industries start doing. And so Bitcoin is open source competing with banks. The use of open source software to do remittances worldwide, to do treasury management worldwide, to do banking worldwide. And this part of my career has been very, very interesting to me, looking at companies that never considered themselves to be technology companies, dealing with open source disruption and open source innovation in the same way that my old enterprise software clients had to. And so it's been a really interesting path, and it's been a really interesting decade of my life. Well, actually more like 14 years. God, I feel old now. And I think that this panel actually clearly represents kind of all of those areas in the ecosystem. So I'm really interested in hearing what they're going to say. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and I think he's got slides.
I do. All right. I have to stand up when I read slides. It's just a force of habit. So if you don't mind, I'll just stand right here and done. I'll come back and sit down. I encourage my fellow panelists to do the same thing. Yeah. So I wanted to talk to you today. I thought about what maybe folks from Fujitsu and the Fujitsu ecosystem might be interested in terms of large challenges that the industry, in particular companies like yours, are facing, and how open source fits into those things. I think the big trends that are important right now and that are affecting organizations like Fujitsu and essentially every sector of tech can be summarized in these few points. One, software is abstracting a lot of value that was traditionally found in hardware. Server virtualization is certainly very mature and has already done that. Software-defined networking is doing that very rapidly in the network equipment space. Network function virtualization, while it's in its early stages, will certainly do that in the telecommunications equipment space. You know, storage virtualization, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think it's an irreversible trend that software is abstracting much hardware functionality, and that is commoditizing hardware, which is difficult if you're in the hardware business. But here's the scary part. It's actually much worse than that, because while that value from hardware is being abstracted into software and commoditizing hardware, open source comes along and is also commoditizing software. So you might as well all just go home because nobody is going to make any kind of money anymore. Everything is just going to be commoditized. And it's all Facebook who's to blame for this. But it's, again, the combination of software abstraction, the dominance of open source in that, and then the premium on software talent based on those previous two challenges has really put tremendous pressure for a wide variety of technology companies that have traditionally been in the business to change. And open source is a big part of that change. And I like to think of this in terms of the way technology companies spend money on research and development. The top 10 tech companies in the world spend about $60 billion a year. Microsoft, $9 billion, Cisco, $5.8. It's a tremendous amount of money. But what's happening is a lot of the value that is being used to offer products and services to your customers is not coming from internal research and development. It's coming from projects like Linux or things like Firefox or a company like Facebook running most of their company on open source software. It's coming from innovation that's happening outside of your company. And so the question I'd like to ask all of you to think about is how are you managing your external research and development? If much of the software that you're using in your products and services comes from outside of your company and you're spending billions of dollars on internal research and development, don't you think you should put a better process and better thought into how you manage research and development outside of your company? And that's what open source really does. And the best companies in the world actually have these people. These are examples. These are actual people who, their full-time job, and the full-time job of, in some cases, hundreds of people who report to them or report up to them is managing external research and development. Chris DeBona at Google, Ahmad Susu at Intel, Ibrahim Haddad at Samsung. All of these people manage external research and development. They have specialized groups. This is all that those companies, those people in those companies do. And they're obviously some of the biggest names in the technology industry. These groups are growing in terms of the scope of their work, in terms of the depth of their, when you talk to any of these companies, it's a very important part of their competitive strategy over time. Because what we're seeing in terms of the use of external R&D in software is a big shift from an average company having about 30% of the source code that they use in the products that they sell to their customers being open source, the other 70% being proprietary software that they build in-house, to about 80% of software used in the telecommunications equipment, the servers, most of the things that run companies like Facebook or Google or Amazon really being open source software. And if you're able to embrace this, it's a very effective business tool to get better products to market faster by shedding commodity R&D, sharing it with others, and focusing on the 20% of the software code that actually adds value to your customers. This is what the future looks like for most companies who will maintain competitiveness in technology and in software development. The majority of the code will be shed as commodity R&D. The Linux kernel is a great example of that. And as you get higher up on the stack, you're seeing, whether it's things like Hadoop or other database efforts, increasingly being open source. And the best companies are really focusing on, whether it's algorithms to sort your news feed, or in the case of Twitter, helping manage their user base and data. They really don't care about their source code. They open source all of it. And it's not just web companies. These are also companies that create mobile devices and other things. The result is billions of dollars in cost savings, faster time to market. By managing external R&D, you can align your research and development internally with external research and development to get changes you might make to that code into the project so that you don't have to maintain that code over long periods of time. And it also enables you to attract better software engineers and talent. Most of the best software engineers in the world all are prominent leaders in open source projects. Sony Mobile is a great example of a company that publicly states about 80% of the code in our handsets are made up of open source software. If they would ship a Firefox device, I think it would be even higher percentage of open source code in their devices. Samsung recently stated in the Wall Street Journal, we just simply cannot make products without using open source software. We won't get to market fast enough. We won't be competitive enough. We won't be able to focus on the components of the technology we offer that matter to our customers. But the question I always get asked when I tell people that everyone's moving to open source and you can't do anything without open source, you can't build anything open source, what about Apple, right? Apple is the most closed company in the world. They have proprietary silicon, they have a closed app store, their UI, a notoriously closed company, right? They're just, they don't claim to be open. The question is, do they actually do the same thing? And how many people here have an iPhone? Wow, I thought you would all have Fujitsu devices. They're wonderful handsets. They make some great Android phones. But even Apple, if you go into your iPhone, go into the general about and legal notices section, what you will find in there is the GPL license. You will find the names of Linux Foundation fellows like Ted Cho. You'll see actually software that comes out of SUSE, a major Linux distribution. There's actually thousands and thousands of open source code inside of every iPad, every iPhone, every device that Apple makes. So Apple as well leverages and has people inside of Apple, they don't talk about it much, whose full-time job is managing their external research and development, specifically open source software development. Now here's the meat of the argument, because I don't think the world needs much convincing that open source is a great way to shed commodity R&D, share in research, share in development, and get better products to market faster. What I do spend most of my day talking to people about is specifically how to do that. And the way you do that requires meaningful new skills for many companies in the tech sector. Skills in terms of building a strategy, deciding which open source projects work for your business goals, determining which open source projects have more momentum than others. Betting on open source projects is just as important as choosing, in the past, the proprietary components that you would partner with from a business development perspective or to build whatever product and service that you might have been doing. You need to understand strategically intellectual property. You need to understand how to share what you want to share in order to shed commodity R&D, in order to get to market faster, in order to build better products. But you also need to understand how to keep what you want to keep. And if you understand the intellectual property regimes of open source, the licenses, how they interact with other components, you can actually do that in a very systematic way. You need to ingrain this entire set of strategy and expertise into your development process using modern development tools like Git. There's a social coding style, whether it's through email, internet relay chat, that your engineers need to utilize more effectively. This can be useful in not only managing external R&D, but it also can be useful in consolidating research and development and software development across many different business units. Samsung is a great example who uses not only this development process internally, but externally so that they can consolidate development across the dozens of different disparate business units that that company is made up of. And all of this integrates into a comprehensive business process that I recommend companies who really want to embrace this future deploy within their enterprise. Your peers are already doing this. In order to stay competitive, all the best companies need to invest in this. And what's interesting is when you actually do a systematic development of an external research and development policy, what you may find is new business opportunities that unveil themselves in that process as well. Because open source software isn't just a great way to develop software, it's also a very early leading indicator of major technical trends. When Hadoop was very young, if you had been involved in that project early, you may have had better insight into how to build a big data business that could have been very profitable. I think there still are opportunities like that. But what this does is it provides tremendous visibility into very early stage leading technical trends, because in open source, that's where they're all happening. So I encourage you all to look at that. Hopefully this will foster some discussion amongst the group, and I want to thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jim, for actually helping prepare a lot of my talk. We at Facebook believe in a lot of the things that Jim said. We've been big believers in open source since actually the inception of the company back in 2004. And just to get a little background on myself, I started working in open source during my PhD. I worked at Oregon National Laboratories on software MPI, message passing interface, and MPIO, and PBFS, which are parallel file system. So as a graduate student, I became kind of ingrained with it, and I really liked it a lot myself. When I started moving to industry, I always looked for opportunities in working with open source projects and creating as much as I could. But today I'm going to tell you a bit more about the journey of a company some of you may know as Facebook, and how what we've done with open source we think is a little bit different and distinguishes ourselves from some of our competitors. So back in 2004, a young Harvard student, Mark Zuckerberg, begins creating a website, like many other students at his time. His website eventually gained some popularity, and now more than 1 billion people visit it every month. When he started, though, he didn't start inventing his own web server. He didn't write his own operating system. He started with the LAMP stack. So that's Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And so even from the very beginnings of where Facebook began, open source was something really important and something that was a foundation to build on top of. And if any of you worked in startups, you know that even if something's not perfect, if it's out there and open source does 90% of the work, that's a great way to get a shortcut, essentially, to achieving whatever kind of business objectives you're looking for. So if you fast forward a bit to 10 years, I guess, Facebook has contributed to open source in a wide variety of projects across the stack. So all the way from mobile to data to web to infrastructure. And with our efforts in open compute, we have open sourced our server designs, our data centers, and in that process of open compute alone, we've saved more than $1.2 billion in just 3 years. So this is something that we don't only just like to do, but is also important for us to do in terms of growing our business in a healthy way. In web, we've always been, I think, traditionally quite strong on open source technologies. We've, as the LAMP technology I mentioned, but also things like Memcache and other projects. In data, we were right there with the emergence of Hadoop. So we contributed to almost everything that starts with an H there in creating some of those projects. So you can think of Hadoop, HDFS, Hive, HBase. Hive itself was actually created at Facebook when we needed to have this idea of a SQL engine on top of Hadoop. And today those technologies, and I come from data infrastructure at Facebook, so these are probably a little bit more relevant for me. Those technologies are powering a lot of our core analytics engines and data processing platforms. In terms of infra, we've spent a lot of time, for instance, optimizing HHVM, which is like the hip-hop compiler for PHP, making it run way, way faster than the interpreter, and also contributed a lot towards the language itself. So one new area for us is mobile. I mean, we've been a mobile-first company for about 2 years now, and we started to release in that area. So tools such as React.js and POP, which is used for paper, are things that we're really excited about sharing with people and getting some feedback on. So there are 3 areas in which we feel this is important for us. So as I've mentioned already, Facebook is built on a myriad of open source technologies. It's a part of our stack, from your mobile device all the way down into the servers that are living inside our data centers. We can't live without it, and we wouldn't be where we are today without those open source technologies being available. But it's also an important part of our culture. So at Facebook, it's not a very hard process in terms of like, can I use this project or can I use that project? Everything is very engineering driven. Engineers have a lot of say into what they're building and the projects they're working on. So it's just something that we feel like, if there's something out there, great, let's take it, let's use it, let's improve it. And if not, let's build something, let's share it with people and see if it can build traction or it can help somebody else with their job. And the third part is a part of a story of relationships. I think it's about working in the broader ecosystem and I guess for the common good. So one of our company mission is really to make the world more open and connected. And a lot of open source resonates with that. The idea that we're going to share things, we're going to be very transparent as much as we can with what we're doing, and also being part of a global ecosystem. We share some code, we get some code back, we help the community grow, those kinds of things. Now, it also wasn't great for the way we shared code at Facebook. And just to show this picture of a brick wall, that's exactly kind of how some of our projects ended up, unfortunately. So we took some projects early on in our company days, and we said, we want to share this, but we don't really know how, so we're just going to throw it out there on some GitHub repo or create a new Apache project around it, and then we're going to just kind of do our own thing on the side. And when you open source things, it can actually be harmful if you don't try to spend some time building a community around it and engaging with people interested in your project. If people's pull requests or patches sit idle for like 3 years, they're not going to feel very highly about your project or the people or the company that's associated with. So I think this is an area where we have historically maybe not done so well, but in the last year, we've actually taken some serious strides to try to improve a lot of this. And so there's a program kind of now at Facebook, a more formalized program around open source that's led by James Pierce. Actually, I stole a lot of his slides for this talk, so much credit goes to him. But we've been really making open source much more prominent in Facebook and just easier and lower friction than it ever used to be. So here's the virtuous cycle we would like to see with open source. So we have Facebook on the left. There's an arrow at the top where we contribute code and we share things with people. And then there's an arrow at the bottom where people are sharing stuff back with us. We're getting useful patches. We're seeing bugs. We're getting bug fixes for things we haven't even seen yet in our own production settings. But there's the arrow on the right over there where kind of people is going to people. That's the arrow that we've tried to focus on this last year, actually, on improving. And that's the idea that Facebook has to take a bit more of a leadership role in helping build these communities and helping to foster growth there and making sure the communities themselves have a life and energy on their own that's external to Facebook. And so in order to do this, in order to achieve that last arrow, what we've done is kind of hit the reset button. We've said, look, we have this formal program now in place. Let's stop just throwing code over the wall. Let's actually have some organized efforts around, like, hey, if we're going to open source something, answer some questions. How are we going to support this? Do we have enough people in place? What are the processes we're going to do? What are the events we're going to do around these things in order to bring like-minded people together? And we're going to grow the program in such a way that it enhances community, it builds community spirit, and we satisfy our company goal of being open and connected. So I think an early prototype of these efforts is already available out there. So there's a website, code.facebook.com, which is kind of like this centralized hub where you can find everything related to open source that's related to Facebook. So we have an engineering blog where we're talking about the projects that we're doing. Almost all of them are open source, so you can check it out yourself, and the challenges we're facing and why we had to build these particular projects and put this code into place. We also have all our open source projects for the most part there and associated with the Facebook name, and so you can know that's tested at production scale. We know that you have someone backing it. And finally, we have some information about events and conferences where you can kind of hear more about this stuff and how you can get more connected. And through this effort, we've been able to actually receive a lot better feedback from the community. We actually see better contributions. And the next slide here is about metrics. So Facebook is a very data-driven company, like many of the web companies today. So we want to actually understand, what does it mean that to grow a healthy community? What does it mean to be a good steward and good player in the open source community? So what we've done is actually, since we've started changing things, since we've started moving projects off of the brick wall, if you will, or back on the other side of the brick wall, and fixing the problems that we had with our previous processes, these are the changes we see. So we've added actually more than 3 repos per day. In a year, we've added a ton of followers. We see more forking, which indicates more engagement, and lots of more commits. But I think the most impressive number here is really the reduction in pull request time. So the number of pull requests is still going up because we have many more projects, but the time for each pull request is waiting. The sum of those times is decreasing, and that indicates to us that we're being a lot more responsive regarding tasks. We're fixing things, helping engage people better. And finally, the other is issues. So the number of issues outstanding as people report bugs and problems is decreasing as well. And just to close a bit on the point is that Facebook open source is part of our DNA. Like, it's something that's so deeply ingrained into Facebook. We wouldn't be here without it. We love contributing to it. Engineers themselves, me personally, I can speak for myself. I love open source because it gives me a chance to share what I'm doing with a lot of other people. When I talk about my work, I don't have to be secretive about it. I can just say, like, here's the code, you can check it out. It makes me a lot happier to be at work. And in a competitive environment, as Jim was saying, these kind of advantages really help to find people that are not only passionate in certain areas, but also that are very talented in those areas as well. So thank you.
All right. I promise I only have one slide. I have a clicker, but I won't be using it. And I will try to keep this short. I have two things I'm going to talk about. First, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself and why I like open source on a personal level, but then also talk a little bit about why I like open source as a CTO, and not necessarily just as CTO of Mozilla, which is this large, very well-known early open source foundation, but also if I was a CTO somewhere else, I would still like open source. I became very early involved in open source as well, just as Ryan. I think I was 14 or so when I started contributing to a ham radio, packet radio networking stack running on some like Z80 processors. For those of you old enough to remember those days, this was like long before the internet. And it was like bulletin boards via telephone were the closest thing that you would dial into to the internet. And it was like really exciting and cool technology. And when you're 14, the ability to kind of contribute to that and your code runs on like hundreds of nodes all over the world was very cool. And I found open source very empowering. It was my ability to influence the world way beyond what like fellow 14-year-olds could do back in high school. And this kind of trend for me continued. I went then from that into like academia and academic research because it was the closest thing I could find to continue to impact the world by doing things and doing them openly. In academia, this is very natural, and it doesn't really matter what you do if people don't know what you do and they're not convinced that it's good what you're doing. So being open and doing your code in the open is very natural in academia. When I ran into Brendan Eich, Mozilla's former CTO and co-founder, it was a very simple sales pitch for him to convince me to switch away from academia, where I spent most of my life, over to Mozilla, because basically he told me, like, you can do the same things you're doing here in an open manner. The main difference is that instead of like hundreds of people reading your paper, it's going to be like hundreds of millions of people using your code in practice. So it was a very natural transition for me because I could continue with the openness of it, and I can write code that many, many people are using. So these are the things that kind of personally draw me to open source, and I think this connects well to what Avery said, but also Jim. We're in a very competitive landscape where there's a lot of engineers out there who really enjoy working in this open source context. So if I wear my personal hat for a moment, I really like open source. But beyond that, there's actually a lot of good reasons why we should all like open source as technology managers or engineering managers. And I wanted to highlight that for you. There's a little story, a little anecdote around Firefox OS. Firefox OS is an open source smartphone operating system, an ecosystem that Mozilla has been doing for the last 3.5 years or so. I was one of the co-founders of this project, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about the early days of Firefox OS. There are some really interesting lessons to be learned around open source, I think. When we started the project a little bit over 3 years ago, it really started with like 2 engineers, Chris Jones and myself. We were in a conversation. We were trying to identify, why don't we build smartphones with the web? Why do we build smartphones with native technology like iOS or Android? And at that point, we started this big campaign around telling the world that the web is now ready as a technology platform and is competitive as native platforms. If that's true, why are we not building certain things with the web? And mobile devices was one of those areas where we didn't have an answer. So we decided we should just build that and find out. And maybe it can't be done, maybe it can be done. The only way to really find out is to kind of go and build it. And we realized fairly early on that this is not something we can just the 2 of us build as part of Mozilla's R&D team. So what we did is we sent an email to a mailing list saying that we really think there should be an open technology, open web smartphone operating system. We should build that. And we created an empty GitHub repository. And it was a pretty ballsy thing to do, but it worked out because the next day, a large operator, Telefonica, one of the largest network operators, smartphone network, cell phone network operators in the world, approached us, and one of the engineers reached out and said, hey, like an HTML5 operating system for smartphones, it's really cool. We have been working on this like for a couple months now internally, and we have some engineers on this, and we should collaborate, right? Like you guys know the web stack and browser engines and the web engine, and we know like HTML5 and telephony and telephony standards. So we basically really
a perfect match made in heaven. And we started collaborating with Telefonica at the code level, like writing code together with them on day 2 of the project. So day 1 was like us sending an email to a mailing list saying that let's do a smartphone OS in HTML5. And then day 2, Telefonica engineers started engaging with us and started building it with them. And this was not a once, like a singularity, like a one-time occurrence. Maybe 3 years later or so, we engaged in a conversation with Qualcomm, one of the largest technology providers in the telephony and smartphone space. And as a little bit of background for Qualcomm, in case you don't know them, Qualcomm also has a deep history as an IP portfolio company. They have a lot of patents around telephony Qualcomm owns. So they are very, very big on IP and licensing and all these things. We met with Qualcomm, and we showed them what we were trying to do, and 2 or 3 days later, we started collaborating with Qualcomm engineers on building code around Firefox OS together. And in total, it took us a little bit less than 2 years, a couple of days short of 2 years, to bring a smartphone from a crazy email on a mailing list all the way into consumers' hands in Latin America. And this compressed timeline was only possible because of open source and open source licenses. Because all this collaboration at the engineering level could start long before the business people and lawyers actually had figured out all the agreements. As an example, with Telefonica, which was the first operator we launched with, we finally ended up signing all the legal agreements to actually do this project together the day before launch. So it took us about 2 years to do all the legal paperwork and all the business paperwork to agree on what actually we are doing. And in the meantime, like large engineering organizations, just hundreds of people were building these things. And we could build it in parallel because you're not dependent on any of those licensing negotiations. You're not dependent on any business relationships. We simply had a joint interest in technology and a joint interest in products from a very different perspectives, potentially, as a Telefonica or as a Qualcomm or as a Mozilla. But we could jointly collaborate in an open source repositories. And this was, for me, really an important experience because it highlighted that there's a lot more to open source than just like the religious nature of it. Like, as Mozilla, we really like open source because we honestly believe it's the right way to do it, and it's a better thing for humanity. And there's a lot of things that a nonprofit foundation would like about open source. But even way beyond that, simply if you're dealing with technology and if you're dealing with engineering and building things, if it's something that you cannot build on your own with 2 engineers, such as a smartphone operating system, open source really allows you to kind of force multiply and scale up much, much quicker than any other approach to technology or approach to collaboration. And I think this is where this really connects to some of the things that Jim said around relationships. Like, everything we do today as Mozilla is really dominated by open source and our approach to open source. And we don't think that it would be possible to do the things at the scale that we are doing and at the speed that we are doing them if we were not using open source. Thank you.
So we're going to move into a little bit of a panel discussion first, and then when we have time, we'll take audience questions if we have any. So starting in the news pretty recently, there was a bug called the Heartbleed bug, which was a problem with a core project in the open source ecosystem called OpenSSL, which about 3/4 of the internet uses to do secure communication between servers and clients. So basically everything that you've done in a web browser, including your online banking, including your email, the reason you felt safe was you see this little lock on your screen. And the reason that little lock meant something was because OpenSSL exists. And it was discovered that that lock was kind of bullshit for a couple of years. There was a really big bug. And the entire tech industry kind of had a collective freak out. And what we found out was there was this one guy in England who had been contributing to OpenSSL part-time for years and did not have a software engineering job, and that he was the core person supporting OpenSSL, and nobody else, it was their thing. And so this brings up kind of a much broader question, which is as we get these startups that leverage 80% open source to build their 20% proprietary, or in the case of companies like Facebook and companies like mine, more like 90% open source, 10% proprietary. How do we identify these shared resources that we're really relying on, and how do we measure how well supported they are? So when necessary, we can spend part of our revenue in the case of companies like Fujitsu or Facebook, or part of our venture capital in cases of companies like mine, on making sure that these projects have the level of support that I would expect from an enterprise vendor. And so this one's for Jim because I think he's working on it.
Yeah, we are working on it. We're actually working with Fujitsu and Facebook and Amazon and Google and a wide variety of companies on this very topic. There are a few points I would make about Heartbleed in retrospect. One is I don't think the Heartbleed and a bug found in OpenSSL is a sort of statement on the health of the broader open source ecosystem. By and large, as you witness in Linux or Hadoop or the many projects that Facebook uses, the work that's going on in Mozilla, there is a healthy open source economy. Now, in all economies, you have some market failures. And in the case of OpenSSL, I think that's what we're really looking at, is a market failure where over time, for a variety of reasons, OpenSSL became critical and core to internet security and stability. And everybody else thought that someone else was working on it, right? The Facebook guys said to the I thought the Google guys were working on this one, and the Amazon folks were like, no, we thought Facebook had it covered. But there clearly was not a broad audience and technical community working on it. It was a few very senior developers who have a great deal of expertise working kind of tirelessly on this and having almost no resources to do that. And OpenSSL is one. There are others. And when this happened, the Linux Foundation and companies like Fujitsu and all these other firms got together and decided to raise millions of dollars to go find these market failures. And let me be specific. These are projects like OpenSSL that are critical to the stability and security of the internet, but for some reason have gone unfunded, right? So you have to have some critical mass. You have to be widely adopted. You have to be important. There's lots of projects on GitHub that I'm sure, with all due respect to those projects, nobody cares about them. No one will ever likely will. OpenSSL is not one of them. And so we want to identify these projects. We want to provide them with resources. In the case of OpenSSL, we hired that gentleman and another one to work full-time on the project. We also are working with an organization called the Open Crypto Audit Project to do a full-scale audit of OpenSSL. So resources for the project, third-party audit work. And we've done this for a couple more projects that fit that criteria. Network time protocol, this is what keeps the clocks running on the internet, which works in terms of multi-factor authentication and things like that. We provided fellowships for developers there. OpenSSH, universally used for secure login, needed resources for infrastructure and developers as well. So we have a group of companies, of which Fujitsu is one, and many others who are working on this. We have an advisory board made up of some of the best minds in security, Bruce Schneier, who's sort of the father of a lot of cryptography thinking, people from the legal community, people from the MacArthur Foundation who work on these things. And so I think, for every failure, there's a silver lining, and we hope to find that in OpenSSL.
So I'm going to make a formal request. Could you guys hire someone like Bruce or maybe Dan Kaminsky to do a crypto audit of Bitcoin? That'd be really useful. We've got about $9 billion riding on it right now.
So it's Matt Green, and who you probably know. We can certainly consider that. I will say that while we're looking for help working on cryptography projects, all these people seem to be working on Bitcoin. And so it's hard to find people who want to audit because they're all actually working on Bitcoin projects themselves. But that's duly noted.
We resemble that remark. I stole my co-founder from Google.
Fair enough.
Avery, do you have anything to contribute? I know that Facebook has open sourced a lot of its big projects. There are other projects that you rely on that didn't originate within your company. How do you identify which ones you want to really support?
So Facebook, we kind of just pick the projects that make the most sense for our business use cases. We don't have any real official policies around it. Again, Facebook is a very engineering-driven company, which means engineers select the technology they want to work with, the languages they want to work in, and ultimately the people and the projects that are involved. So I think, just from a practical standpoint, most engineers will survey the landscape. We have a new project idea, we want to do something. We'll survey the landscape and say, hey, what's out there already? Can we use it? Can we leverage it? If not, can we build something that may be useful for this space for other people to try out? And in terms of supporting other projects, Facebook, we try as much as we can to find and help contribute to organizations such as the ones working on the Heartbeat bug, but other organizations that are working to advance the state of open source software, especially in the areas that we care about. So, Linux and security, mobile. I mean, and for all these areas are general areas we care about a lot, and we'll do our best to contribute and help make sure those areas are very healthy in their ecosystem.
So Andreas, I think you might have a really interesting perspective on this too. Mozilla is really the biggest when it comes to deploying open source software to consumers and also judging how that software interacts with third-party open source software like on the server side. You guys are the ones that showed me that lock.
Yeah, so I think we were in the same position as everyone else, that we also assumed that someone else had it covered. Otherwise, we would have tried to cover it. So this is simply driven by business needs. One of the core brand values that Firefox and Mozilla have is security and privacy and safety and all those things that are being threatened by what's going on with this vulnerability on the Heartbleed issue. And as a result of that, as we use external open source projects, which we do en masse, we of course are dependent on the health of the community and of the code, and we simply do what everyone else does. We try to invest if we recognize in time that a project is struggling or needs resources. In our particular case, because we are much smaller than like a Facebook or a Google, in some cases we're a little bit more limited. So in some cases we start using open source projects like Cairo, which is a 2D rendering library. And we really like it, but nobody else seems to like it these days anymore. It's just kind of like, it's just dying. And we don't have enough resources to kind of pour in there to keep it on a respirator. And the new thing that everyone is doing is what Google did around Skia. So Skia is the new hotness, and everyone's like flocking there. So in some cases, then you simply have to respond to that. And if you're using external R&D resources, as you put it on your slides, you have to go where like the market is going, and we have to now switch from like Cairo to Skia, which is incredibly painful to do, but at the same time, we will be able to leverage where like everyone else is, and we can then use all the external investment others are doing in Skia in the future of in Firefox and to rendering with that. So it requires you to keep kind of like up with the times and switch projects in some cases.
Yeah, we actually have a similar problem. We really rely on a project called Thunderbird, and I think we're the only ones who use it. We don't really have the resources to support it ourselves. It can be an issue. So Andreas, staying on you for a second. There's been kind of this broader issue about security and privacy, especially in the wake of the national security scandals. The NSA has been found to be hacking into major companies like Verizon and even Facebook. What role can open source software play in code transparency and having a relationship between the users and the software developers? What role can all that stuff play in helping us feel more confident and comfortable about our privacy as consumers and as businesses?
So we talked about many different ways how open source has advantages, and we talked about like the business parts of it and the security parts of it. Around privacy, this is a particularly interesting topic because here, in our view, open source is really a unique advantage. You cannot replicate it with any other approach or software engineering approach or technology approach. What we found is the most recent revelations around Edward Snowden and some of the things that the NSA and the government at large are doing is it's a very tricky environment because many of these things are considered legal. So you can find yourself in a situation where large companies like Facebook are suddenly kind of like coerced or forced or enticed or whichever word you want to use to participate in schemes that violate the end user's expectation of privacy, and it's not clear that any of them want to participate in it, but it's simply there's like certain laws and regulations that might require you to do that. And we are very worried that we might get in the same circumstance, that like someone is coming to us and it's showing us a statute or a certain regulation that might force us to do things we really don't want to do, that we think violate the privacy expectations of our users. And in some cases, these laws are written in such a way that even if the government were to come to us, we would not even be able to tell you that they did. And they might even make us force us to kind of change the code in ways we don't want to change it. And all these things are very hard to defend against. And if you see like titans like Google and Facebook kind of roll over and participate, then it's kind of clear that it's very hard to resist that. Once like there's like laws written and even like armies of lawyers, it's hard to hold off that. And we found open source to be very unique here because the approach we are taking is we try to be as transparent as we possibly can. Like every bit that comes in Firefox, we make available as open source, and we invite you to compile it yourself. And that's one way of using it. And this is mostly for the kind of tinfoil hat community. Like if you know how to compile Firefox, you can compile it yourself and run it yourself, and it gives you the chance to inspect the source code, which is a lot easier to inspect than the binary that we download. But you can even go beyond that, and if you make the build itself reproducible, then it gives really actually researchers and organizations a chance to verify what Mozilla does internally. So you can take the source code we publish, you can take the binary we publish, and you can kind of rebuild it on your own and see whether the binary bits match up. And if they do, then at least you know that you can look at the source code and you can try to infer certain things, and you can try to see bad things happening. And we even blogged about this, and we encourage security researchers to do this because we feel this is the only way for us to defend ourselves.
Yeah.
Basically, we can make sure that if ever anything happens that we don't want to happen, people will have a chance to see that. And we have the chance to can talk about that. And if they're outside US jurisdiction, for example, then they might be able to respond to that and raise an alarm. And this is really very unique because it's clear that short of this aspect of open source, there doesn't seem to be a lot of other defense mechanisms that we have right now as long the legal environment doesn't change.
So it's almost like the revenge of trusted computing. I remember a decade ago, one thing that I was working on that I think Jim was working on too, was Microsoft was putting chips on the motherboard that could authenticate the software, the encryption signatures of binaries to make sure that the computer was running authorized code. But the problem for that was you couldn't run things like Linux and Firefox if they weren't certified by the hardware manufacturer as authorized. So it really shut down a lot of consumer choice in running what ran on the computer. I see deterministic builds as the more consumer-friendly way to accomplish the same goal, but it presupposes open source. Moving on from that topic, because I can see that our time is ticking away. We really wanted to have a conversation about how we can build open source principles into our engineering organization, and also about how it works as an engineer and as a manager within an organization that really cares about open source principles. So let's start with Avery on this topic. How does Facebook do it?
Sure. So I actually can tell you how I came to Facebook. Maybe that story will be a little interesting. So I used to work at Yahoo. I worked on web search there, and part of my time there, I worked on a couple open source projects. One of those was something called Apache Giraffe, which is a large-scale graph processing engine. And I presented at a conference. The code's always open source as part of Apache. And through that, that's actually kind of how Facebook found me and said, hey, we have a social graph here. You can go process it. And so we did an interview, and that's how I ended up joining. And I think a big part of the reason why I joined Facebook was because of the fact that I knew there's such a proponent of open source. I knew that being that my project I worked on was open source, I could kind of also still work on it even when I changed companies. And so from a developer engineering perspective, the ability to kind of like keep your work with you kind of as you go from company to company is a really enticing thing from going from place to next. And from from even in a company itself, being able to identify, again, those key players in different technologies because you see their open source projects, you see their contributions, and the quality of the contributions is really valuable in terms of identifying the talent and identifying people that you want to come have work with you.
Code is the new resume.
It is.
It's, we look at GitHub profiles. We don't even look at resumes. So Jim, you've worked with a lot of the biggest vendors in the space on these questions of how do you build a strategy for the open source part of an organization? How do you build this kind of culture into, I'm almost afraid to say, legacy institution that built up all of their culture before this was a big deal?
Well, it does take some time. I will say I'm a horrible engineering manager in all definitions of it. In fact, we only have a couple of engineers at the Linux Foundation, and they don't listen to anything that I say at all.
I've seen the mailing list, it's true.
Yeah, that's true. Everything that Linus Torvalds says is his own thing, nothing to do with me. It takes time, and I put up on my slide, there's a set of business processes that you can put in place. I mean, Facebook is a very engineering-led organization, but I mean, there's a intentional structure inside of Facebook that allows engineers to know what they can participate in outside of the company, inside of the company. I'm sure that there are certain licenses that that are okay versus not okay. There's an entire business process that every single company, Facebook maybe is a little bit more loosely structured due to your culture. Some are very, very tightly structured. But you have to have, if you don't have this, you are well behind competitively in the market. So we help and have training courses to help people do that. Now, why would the Linux Foundation as a nonprofit want to do that work? Because we just care about more source code being available in the world. So it helps business take advantage of open source. It helps us because more code actually ends up coming out of these companies. Yeah. Now, I'll give you one specific case with Fujitsu. More than 15 years ago, we started working with Fujitsu, and at that time in Japan, Linux kernel contributions from Japanese individuals were virtually zero, like 1%. And over 5 to 8 years, we would bring kernel developers to Japan, have them build relationship with engineers inside of Fujitsu and Hitachi and NEC. And over that period of time, kernel contributions from Japan, I think, are now at 10%. A massive increase in influence for Japanese companies in one of the largest open source project in the world. And so it's that building not only a process, but this is the important part that Avery exemplifies, the relationships within these communities so that, you know, if Avery wants to leave Yahoo, you can say, hey, we got this great role at Facebook. You wouldn't even have known him if you weren't participating in these communities, which obviously engineers at Facebook were when they met you.
So we've only got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to skip the other 2 questions that I had here. I wanted to talk about the emergence of open source in phone hardware and the fight that Firefox OS and also Android are fighting to try and push open source farther down the stack to make open hardware a bigger deal. And this is something that Facebook's been doing on the server side. That's a discussion that we can't have on the stage, but I encourage you to come up and ask the speakers about. The other one that we wanted to talk about really quickly before I go to audience questions was what are the possible business models here now that software licensing is kind of off the table? Proprietary software companies are getting out competed by open source projects. 60 seconds or less on that?
Advertising and search. It's like buttons, advertisement if you're not.
Proprietary algorithms, maybe?
That's the funny answer. The true answer in 30 seconds is the entire tech industry is moving from a products model to a services model. I think that's fairly clear. You'll see that in infrastructure as a service. You see that in software as a service. I mean, as you abstract more functionality, and network functional virtualization will be the next big move from a hardware product-driven economy to a service. Network functions will be deployed as a service and paid for by. It's the move from a product world to a services world that is challenging for a lot of companies. I think that's the big shift that open source and open hardware are creating.
So you heard it here first. Cisco is going to be moving away from routers into WebEx. Okay, do we have any audience questions? We've got 2.5 minutes left. All right, I think then we can have the smartphone discussion after all.
All right. 日本語でも構いません。どうぞ聞いてください。I tried.
All right, so to kick it off, open hardware has been a big topic in the news. Facebook kind of commoditized how they do hardware acquisition, and that was very interesting. And then Google tried to do the same thing on phones, and Mozilla's been pushing even farther than that. How far are we from being able to know the code that's running on your device, even when the hardware vendor is part of writing it?
Yeah, so I think, interestingly, probably 5 years ago, we were a little bit further along than as we were today. When Google started with Android, I think one of their intents was to really commoditize completely the hardware and software stack running under the services that come on a phone. And that's probably the reason that Android started out with the source code available. But then, unfortunately, Google discovered that if you make a closed system, you can fantastically monetize inside of it and nobody can compete with you. And so that kind of like stopped really the evolution of the openness of Android. And Today we call it a more available source than open source because you can get the source, but you can't really participate in like making the source or the technology future of the source. So that was one of the reasons that we started Firefox OS is we wanted an open ecosystem based on open technology and open standards and also like open implementation, of course. And the success of this really will depend whether we can get a sufficient scale. We are right now targeting specific markets. We have to get the necessary growth there to really have the scale to really influence then the silicon vendors, for example. So today, Firefox OS kind of tops out in openness around the same point where Android tops out. When you touch the silicon underneath you, the drivers are usually closed, the GPU stack is closed, the radio stack is closed. But our intent is to, assuming we get sufficient scale, to then basically try to shift the market around and make people start to compete over just how open they are and how much of their stack is open. Whether we get there really depends on the necessary scale to influence the markets.
So we're looking at the commit logs for the Linux kernel. We are starting to see hardware vendors like, it's flashing at me, but I'm going to keep going for like 30 seconds because I want to hear Jim's answer to this. We're starting to see hardware vendors like Fujitsu and Samsung and others start to contribute more and more code to Linux. Do we think that that's going to result in a cultural change where they start open sourcing more of their code themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it already has, really. I mean, you know, we see less and less closed, in particular at that, what I would describe as the commodity layer of software, less closed software. We wrote a white paper, actually, called The Tale of Two Device Drivers, which I think you would enjoy. It basically describes trying to create a proprietary device driver versus trying to just integrate a device driver into the Linux kernel. And purely from a business benefit perspective, we didn't really talk about open source versus others, but just why it's more secure, it's easier to maintain, it will cost you less, you're not really giving up any important intellectual property relative to the benefit of the cost effectiveness and quality and security of having the kernel community maintain this code. And that has turned out to be a very compelling business argument that has driven hundreds of thousands of lines of code into the open. As much as I truly believe in the nature of open source as a model for sharing, I think that it's important that the software that runs most of modern society, at least in the case of Linux, be a shared asset, not an owned asset by a single entity. But what is wonderful is you have both a true business benefit and something that's positive for society in this effort. And so I think understanding that is very important. And what we've seen is that that understanding has really come to pass, which is great.
The triumph of the commons.
It is. Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for coming out. This has been a really fun panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I don't have a summary of that one. I'm not sure I got it all. There's a lot of talent in that group. So we're just going to take a short break here. There are refreshments just outside the doors of the auditorium and in the grand lobby. We'll reconvene at 3:40 p.m. And don't forget those survey forms. Thanks.